Hello and welcome to our lesson on forms and UI elements. Now you may be thinking to yourself, what are UI elements? And that's a very good question. UI elements are basically just elements within your user interface. Like, take a look over here at this picture. We have cards, we have some icons, we have a navigation, we have a badge on an icon right there. We also have like a little picker over here. And these are all considered UI elements. But forms are probably the most common UI elements that we actually experience. And probably, if not the most important. So let's take a step back. Forms are everywhere. Think about it. We might think that a form is just a standard set of inputs on a page, but when we're designing a user experience, they are featured in a lot of different places. Take this for example. This is considered a form. When you log right into a product, you have some elements here like a button, you have a forgot your password link, and you have different form inputs like this is your standard password input and this is your standard email input. And these all come together to create a form, even these social logins over here. What about when you even send a message? This is considered a form. This, alongside these buttons, are considered a larger form component. Forms are everywhere. Even when you search, this is considered a form. They are crucial to the success of your design and can impact the business of the product if certain forms rely on optimization and hitting certain goals. With forms being such an integral part of building products, it's critical to get them right. But don't be scared, we're going to learn how to build some brilliant forms and UI elements that are really delightful, usable, and inclusive. So you may be thinking, where do we start? Okay, are you ready? Remember how we built our own sitemap? Well, we talked about building some preliminary sitemaps, user flows, and concepts earlier. When we did that, we were thinking about the types of content we would have on certain pages. Before we even begin thinking about designing a form, we need to know what type of content we were dealing with. So when we looked back at the home page that we built for Habitual, we were talking about the sitemap, and at this portion, we knew that users will probably want to search for products over here. We kind of listed that as a piece of content that we were definitely going to have on that page. So with us thinking about search, we drew a bunch of search inputs. We drew what that search overlay would look like, and that is all considered a form that comes together. Now, we definitely know we need a search bar. Another example is registration. We touched a bit on that earlier as well. This is a bit more trickier. We know the standard types of UI elements that will be used to build the forms a user may see, like text inputs, buttons, maybe a progress bar. We saw that in the example earlier. But it's not that easy though. We also need to take into account if the registration wants to capture other content like user interests or profile images. So before we even build a form, we need to think about the types of questions we want to ask our user. This takes some time to figure out and can be done through some quick prototyping, testing, and iteration. So you can find the result that works best for your product. We'll come back to this scenario later, but the goal here is to generate some ideas and come back to them. That always just keeps on coming up in our design process, is that we need to keep on generating ideas, learn from those ideas, refine them, and then keep on going. So same thing with forms. We need to think about the types of questions we need to ask our users because it's incredibly important that we get that right. And then we can iterate and refine the details later. So you want to start building some components for your product, right? Well, we're going to cover a wide array of examples of different types of forms and accompanying UI elements. We'll be covering like forms, inputs, advanced inputs, and buttons. We're going to jump right into Figma to take a look at the different types of scenarios we often face as designers.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to get into forms and miscellaneous UI elements. Now, the great thing about forms and these types of UI elements is that this is kind of like some of the bread and butter of just like working as a product designer or a UX UI designer, web designer. You know, you're going to be working with a lot of different things like this, processes with like registration and stuff like that. You're going to learn a ton in this section. We're going to learn things like the best practices for forms. We're going to get into like the do's and the don'ts of that. We're going to learn about all the different types of inputs that we generally will come across, basic and advanced. We'll learn about how to deploy some of these inputs in different instances, what to do and what not to do. Same with buttons. We're going to get into ways that we can make our buttons much better. And we are going to learn a lot about components. We're going to learn about different ways that we can make some great components, whether it's with component properties like you see over here, or with just variants in general in these bounding boxes. Then we will also go through some exercises building our own components with properties and variants. Then we are going to go back to our product. We're going to work on a little project where we are going to start thinking about our registration flow and what that looks like for that onboarding experience. Using some of our old sketches, we can use some of our user flows, but we will be building a very basic flow here with some of the components that we've already built. So let's jump right in because this section is really going to be great. Hey everyone, we are going to be jumping into the best practices for forms. Before we can actually get into things like other components like inputs, advanced inputs, buttons, we need to talk about forms as a whole. Personally, I think that's just the better approach. Now, forms essentially replace the conversations we have with each other. So when you design a form, you should always keep in mind that they should feel like a friendly conversation between your user and the product. So let's jump in. Now, number one, the number of questions in a form. Let's take a look at this version over here. This is a lot for a user to take in. Over here, we have a form. It's super long and it's kind of demoralizing. When creating a form, we need to keep it as short as possible and only ask the questions that are absolutely necessary. Remember that if there are some optional inputs that absolutely need to be there, we should mark them as such and avoid using an asterisk. If some inputs are optional, do you really need those inputs at all? That's a question you should really ask yourself. Asterisks, they also muddy your design a bit and they create a bit of visual noise. So I would really think about using them. Here, let's take a look at how this has been fixed. So I just have used the full name, email, and password rather than having just a first name and last name. Sometimes from a development perspective, we need to have those two fields just split out due to the data structure. But do we really need to ask for things like your country or your phone number? Definitely optional. The next option is the order of questions. Remember what we said about making your forms conversational? Yeah, they should also logically flow like a conversation. What is the first thing you ask a person when you meet them? Their name, right? You wouldn't ask for their address or credit card information first. We should definitely start with their name and then move on to some more sensitive questions. Let's take a look at this version. Full name, email, address, then your credit card number. You're kind of easing into it here. The next best practice is categorize if you need to. Sometimes you may be tasked with building long flows or just long forms. That happens. It could be for a long registration form or inputting your taxes. A big no-no is to have all those inputs grouped together like this, because we run the risk of confusing our user. The solution? Try to categorize relatable information like I've done on this side. We have our payment method over here, and then we've brought out the billing information. Some flows will get long and you can only break them down so far, but this is much better than this version over here. Next, let's think about layout. Now, yes, layout applies to your forms as well. We have all been guilty of this. Including me when I was first starting out. Forms should always be arranged from top to bottom in a single column so it's easy for a user to read. We typically read from top to bottom and left to right, and this implementation makes me wonder in which direction I should start to fill out inputs. Should I start up here? Should I start up here? I mean, it's adding a layer of unnecessary complexity. Instead, just stack them. Let's talk about buttons. Okay, this is a big debate, and I don't really sway either way in terms of the placement of your buttons at the end of the form. Some people will argue that buttons should be left aligned to a form because we logically read from top to bottom, left to right, meaning that the button will be right there waiting for you at the end of the form. But sometimes when you think about how we think about forms and proceeding to the next step, we generally think moving right is the next step and left is for going back. So generally, I will, it really depends on the form. I will usually go on the right side. Others I've seen it actually more prevalent now, so I've been trying it out a bit. It really depends on your type of form as well. So simple modals or something like that, I wouldn't mind putting on the left. But when we're talking about like having back buttons, having the back buttons swapped around is hard. Another scenario is that you may have two buttons, like I've just mentioned, right? Like you have a submit and a cancel. And we have to make sure that both buttons are easily distinguishable to avoid the possibility that a user clicks the wrong button. You can easily do that with a secondary button. You should do your best also to add microcopy wherever possible and be descriptive with your button names. We'll get into that a bit later. But what I've done here is I've put the primary button on the left side and the secondary on the right, so it flows more naturally. So you have your create account and then cancel. So that does look really nice. And I wouldn't mind putting the button here, but if you're going to, follow one type of just practice, keep it consistent. Okay, this one is big. Progress. Remember how we just covered long inputs and broke them into different categories? I kind of mentioned this a little bit there. Sometimes forms are so long that you need to split them into different pages entirely, which is entirely logical. You don't want a user to infinitely scroll on one page to fill out a super long form. Also on mobile, we may treat long forms differently and have users go to separate pages to fill out. When you do this, you need to let the user know where they are within that flow and how much longer they need to go within that flow. This can be done in a variety of ways. There's progress bars, percentages, and even step counters. Let's take a look over here. So just like progress with percentage is an option. I generally don't even put the percentage sometimes. Like I'll use a combination of methods. We have over here, just like the step and a progress. So like this is like a state that's been or you're currently in, and these are the upcoming states. And then we have like this step 1 of 3. So sometimes I'll use like a whole progress bar and then, use something like this where it's like, hey, step 1, step 2. So they don't need the exact percentage just to know how many more steps are left because, even the exact percentage can be a little misleading. And that's it for the best practices for forms. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be talking about basic and advanced inputs. So let's take a guess. Which are the most complex components? If you've guessed inputs, then you are probably correct. They may look simple, but in reality, due to their versatility, different states, and frequent use, they can be very hard to figure out. But when you do get inputs right and they're designed well, they allow users to input data in a way that is quick, easy, and correct. Let's jump right in. So we have our basic inputs. There are a variety of input types that we use to collect user data depending on what type of questions or requirements your form may have. You'll need to pick the right one. So we have the basic text field. These text fields are used for short written responses. Users can probably only add one line of text here, and if their text does get too long, it will automatically scroll the content left so you can continue to see what you are entering. The next one we have here is the text area. Sometimes you may need to incorporate an input for longer responses. This is where the text area comes into play. These are taller than a regular text field and allow for users to enter multiple lines of text. When the text does reach the bottom of the container, it will automatically expand downwards. Some text areas will actually allow users to adjust the width and height manually. So you can do that like this. Drop-down menus. Now these ones are fun. You can call them selects as well. These are used when there are multiple options a user needs to choose from. When you click the input, a menu will appear below where the user will see the predefined options. When a user selects an option, it will appear in the input field that they just clicked. It's best to use drop-down menus when a user needs to select from more than 5 options. So they typically look like this. You open, closed. When you click on it, it opens. That's basically the drop-down. Okay, let's get into the checkbox and the radio buttons. They look very similar, don't they? So checkboxes on the top are typically used when there are one or multiple options for the user to select from. Users can make multiple selections here. Try using these when there are 4 or less options to choose from, so you don't have a super long list. Now, radio buttons. Like I said, they look pretty similar to the checkbox, but the interaction is entirely different. These are used for multiple options, but, and this is big, users can only select one option here. Similar to the checkbox, try keeping the options to 4 or less. Let's get into something a little bit more fun though. Advanced inputs. Oops, let's zoom out so we can find them. Here we go. I have several here. And let's zoom in. There we go. Okay, so sometimes these inputs are not enough for what we are asking of the user. I'm talking about the basic inputs. Some questions can get pretty complex and also some interactions. Let's look at some examples here. So multi-select text fields are really great. They kind of function very similar to a text area, but you type inside of them, and as you type, you can, select like a new option. You've probably used this in some time in your life, maybe adding like some of your interests to something, or adding like different types of things that you do well, or whatever. Now, these fields allow our users to add multiple inputs. Generally, when a user enters an input, it will be displayed as like a little chip, as you see here, or a pill. And the user can add another. Users are able to remove chips that they've previously entered, so they could click on like an X or another icon. Most of the time, it's going to be an X. Okay, now the drop-down search. If there are a bunch of options within your drop-down menu, you should consider adding a contextual search. The way this interaction works is when a user begins typing, available options that will match the user's search will filter. It saves the user a bunch of time. So think about like address pickers that are basically the data pipeline is hooked up to the United States Postal Service in the US. But when you search up an address, you'll have a bunch of different options pop out, and you can easily select one of them. And the last I'm going to get into right now is the date picker. Date pickers are used when we want our user to select a date or a range. This view will show all available dates, months, etc. This can also be done differently, like with single line inputs or radio buttons as well. So that's all we have right now for basic and advanced inputs. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're going to be talking about the best practices around inputs. Now, the height of your input should always be consistent with other input heights. I would even say sometimes you need to make sure that your button and your input heights are all very consistent. I will sometimes make chunkier buttons or, taller buttons because I want people to definitely click on them, but I'm going to make sure that, if my inputs are 40 pixels in height or something like that, my buttons are definitely going to be something like 56 pixels, so they like really stand out and there's enough contrast. If we look over here to the right here, we'll see that that looks much better in comparison to the one on the left. Let's move on to the next best practice. So we have the input field length. Now, all inputs in a form should be the same length, but that is going to vary depending on the type of answer you may ask the user to answer. A good example is when we ask users for their credit card information. The CVV number input file shouldn't be too long because it's generally only 3 digits. Sometimes having long inputs for short answers could confuse the user into thinking they may have entered a too short answer. Now, I would say one of the only exceptions to the rule is this, where, having them on the same line work really well together. They kind of work in tandem. So I don't really mind this as much. Okay, this one seems maybe like a no-brainer, but let's jump in. Your labels should be short and clear and easy to read. It's best to keep your labels short and sweet and to the point. 1 to 2 words is generally enough to describe what is being asked. And the labels should contrast the input font. Generally, people will bold and shrink them a bit. They also lower the opacity sometimes, so I keep it basically a bit lighter than my actual content within here. So if I just turn on that, it's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit lighter, it's going to work much better. And let's take a look at the label over here on this side. Much better instead of just, carrying out this label into a sentence. Another tip is to make sure only the first letter is capitalized for easy scanning and readability. So I'm a big proponent of that and making sure that, I'm using kind of sentence case. Let's talk about something else that there is some debate over. Placeholders. Okay. Now, to placeholder or not to placeholder. I think I just butchered Shakespeare there. I'm sorry. Anyways, placeholders at their best show repetitive information, and at its worst, it hides important information and reduces accessibility. You may be asking why. So when a user clicks on a placeholder and starts to type in an answer, that automatically replaces that placeholder with whatever the user inputted. And this can be a problem if the placeholder is being used as a label or even as a hint. So maybe it's great for things like email and maybe password on a login screen, and you don't necessarily need a label because it's a design pattern that's, commonly understood. But think about the date of birth and thinking about the type of, information or the way we want them to input that data. I wouldn't use it as a placeholder. At that point, the user can no longer see that text when they've actually filled in the input and can't review their answer. So as for accessibility, they are a little harder to see just due to the lightness of the color and are often undetected by page readers. So I rather put them in in a description below or underneath a label or to the right as an optional label. Okay. Now let's talk about icons. So icons in forms can be really, really helpful. You may be thinking icons and inputs. Who would have thought? Let's go over the 3 different scenarios that, we often see. Aesthetic reasons. So sometimes they really serve no purpose but to just reinforce the label or whatever is asked of a user. These are generally in line with the input and just left to the text. So you can think of a search icon or a little email icon. And I think even the credit card icon is pretty helpful sometimes because they will switch it out to show that, this is maybe a MasterCard or a Visa. So that could be really helpful. The other scenario is actionable icons. Some icons will add functionality to your input, which is really great. Some examples of this are chevrons or these arrows pointing down over here. They're often used for things like dropdowns, and they can show and hide information, and they can help give the user additional ways to interact with your input. Look at this one here, password visibility switcher. Usually there's an I here that's crossed out when you can't see the password, but if you click it, and then you can see your password. And now feedback. This one's pretty important. These really help users to understand if an action was successful or not. These are often used in addition to color, and that is super important for accessibility because some colorblind users cannot tell the difference between red and green, and they will rely on icons. So in this example, we have like the wrong username, so it's invalid username, and then a valid username. So it could really help just with little things like that. Let's talk about states. Now, there are a bunch of states that we need to think about when designing inputs. Different states tell the user what is currently happening and what they should do next. These states can be differentiated with things like text, color, and yeah, that's basically a text color. There's even effects. Sometimes people will use like drop shadows and stuff like that. These visual cues are pretty integral to a good input. Let's jump into the different types. So we have the default state. This is what you're probably most used to seeing. This is the default state, and it just shows an empty field that hasn't been interacted with yet. Then we have an active state. This field is active, and that happens when the user clicks into it. This field has a highlighted border, and sometimes we'll have, maybe a drop shadow. They'll have a caret that's blinking over here to show that the cursor's there, and that they should be typing something. Then we have the filled state. Once an input is filled, the user has entered the information and clicked away from the field. Now it looks much similar to the default input, and I think we all understand that this has been completed and they can move on. Okay, now we have our disabled inputs. Now, sometimes we will see these, and when we run into this case where an input should be disabled due to a requirement or maybe a restriction, disabled inputs are really shown as kind of sometimes filled in or grayed out to indicate that you really can't interact with this. So usually, it's grayed out like this with a fill instead of the white. Okay, and our success and error states. Sometimes we will see success states. When an answer is correct, you have the option to show a success message. These are less popular than error states because, most of the time we're successful when we're filling out forms. Similar to the error state, we're definitely going to use things like color, icons, and the appropriate text to really communicate that, something was successful. Now, the error state is a bit more popular. When an answer is incorrect or maybe even missing, the input should show an error message. The message generally should have the appropriate color, icons, and text, and be in line instead of outside of the form. Underneath the corresponding input is fine, like we saw with the success message as well. We kind of touched upon this before in our lesson about just typography and using, error states and using icons and text to really, really drive that point home. Okay. Let's talk about something that's really important now. This is super important, assistance. There will be times when a user comes to an input and needs a bit of assistance, a tip or a hint. This will help the user fill out your input much quicker if you do it right. Here are certain ways we can provide assistance to our users. Hint text is number one. Use hints above or below your input field to give the users helpful information about the question you are asking them. Whether that's a message or a note underneath, or like this for the date of birth. The auto format. We have the power to automatically format a user's answer depending on scenario. This avoids any format errors and helps users read and review their answers. Think credit card numbers, phone numbers, even dates can auto format. Autocomplete. Sometimes users need to enter something long or they may not necessarily know what they are searching for, and we should help them with autocomplete. This saves the user a bunch of time and also reduces the possibility of errors with formatting and spelling. So think of like the address option here, or even if somebody is searching up what are your favorite types of chips? Okay, I'm going to start typing S for salt and vinegar, and I'll see, that as an option pop up and I can quickly press enter. So really, really great option to use something like that as an autocomplete in those types of scenarios. Okay. This one's another one that's pretty interesting. Default values. It's always smart to pre-fill your fields with the most likely answer when the answer is expected by the majority of your users. So one example here is if I come over to this form, many people want their sign-in information to be saved. It's often something that's unchecked, and I personally hate it. I don't want to enter my information over and over again. Sometimes, people will not do it because of a security measure. So just something to think about. But, whether it's like maybe a checkbox that's already pre-checked, or maybe it is like you're an input that is already pre-filled with certain text, like maybe, your city is pre-filled or your country is pre-filled based off of your location or based off of the majority of people in your area that have like used the same service. So definitely some options there in terms of like how to use default values. And those are the best practices for inputs. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to be talking about the best practices for buttons. Now, buttons are a really important part of your UI. I mean, probably one of the most important parts of any UI. They're not only used for forms, but can be used to link users to other parts of the site or within the same page. We should treat buttons like these with a lot of care, and I'm going to show you a couple of things you can do to make your buttons that much better. So let's jump in. Number one, use descriptive or action-based words, or at least try to. Buttons should describe the action you want the user to take. I think submit and cancel they're okay in most technical applications, but they usually feel too dry or generic. Consider using words like sign up or send information or create account. This also helps you emphasize the value of completing a certain action. We want our users to keep motivated, and a way we can do that is to remind the user of the benefits with completing the flow. So in this option here, I just switched it to create account, and it's so much more better than submit. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Consider doing your best to write in the first person. The button is that final interaction that takes a user elsewhere. Try making it personable. It has been proven that buttons that use words like I, me, or my have higher conversion rates. Instead of sign up, maybe try something like create my account. A little trick I use is that whatever the copy is in the button, I will precede that by I want to, so it makes grammatical sense. I want to create my account. So I want to create my account. It adds a little bit of personality to those buttons. On to the next one. Okay, we talked about this a little bit, but you need to differentiate between primary and secondary buttons, and maybe even tertiary buttons. We won't go too deep there right now. You may need to use two buttons at certain points. It happens quite a lot, and you should come up with a primary and secondary button that are easily distinguishable. The rule is that buttons that function differently should appear differently. Remember to make the primary button that should take the user to the expected path, that should be much more prominent. When a user is on mobile, you should probably make buttons easily tappable as well. So I'm thinking 40 to 48 pixels is a really good height for a button, especially if you're using like a base unit of 8. So if we take a look at this option, we have submit and cancel both as a primary button, and then the difference is actually quite large. The user really knows what they're going to be clicking on. Okay, now the last thing I do want to touch upon is the disabled state. Now you need to consider having a disabled button for your user. A disabled button could really help, just to backpedal a bit, a disabled button is good for cases where a user can't progress unless they fill out all required fields. So it can really, really help tell a user that, hey, you need to fill out some stuff here. So this is like a flow where, they haven't filled out their password and then they can't sign in. It's just that simple. Whereas here, they filled out everything. They even clicked this little checkbox and boom, they are ready to sign in. So those are the best practices for buttons. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to be talking about component properties. So what are component properties? You'll see I have a bunch of different assets here. I have icon components, I have variants, and I also, if you go into each individual component here, you'll notice that they do have their own set of properties. So if I take that out, these are properties, and this is the variant. So let's get into it. Component properties assign names and values to elements that can be customized in a component. So you may think, like, what does that mean? So think of things like instances that can be swapped, a text layer that can be updated, or an element's visibility that can be toggled on and off. That's where the real power comes in here. So what are the main benefits? So the main benefits of using component properties allow you to have the reduction in manually created variants. So in the past, you could have so many variants with different icons. Now you can just toggle those things off like this instead of making so many different versions. You have easier discovery of which parts of the component can be customized, closer alignment between design and code. So your developers are going to love you. Now, in terms of reducing variance, with component properties, it will be possible to significantly reduce the amount of variance needed. Like I just mentioned, you won't need so many different versions of different states or different types. Anything that can really be toggled on and off or swapped with an instance is going to be managed just at this level over here when you make an instance. So, an example, you can use a Boolean property to eliminate the need to create multiple versions of that button with and without the icon, like I mentioned prior. In terms of alignment with code, component properties allow you to set up your components with the same attributes you'd have in code. So for example, you could have cut that part out with alignment with code. So what types of properties can be edited? Let's jump into that. If you have a text layer in your component that is intended to be customized, you can create a text property that will surface in the design panel. So let's get a component here, and let me just illustrate that. So here is my component, and if I have this text property right here, I can basically edit that, and it'll show up in my component. This allows you to create a text property with a named value, like, code components often have. Example, like label equals, quotation, click me, and quotation. So you can update your text in the components panel over here without diving into all the sublayers. Sometimes it's hard to just click through all that. In terms of the Boolean component property, like we've seen with the button and toggling, this is what a Boolean property is. No more digging into the layers panel to swap an instance. You can do this all from the actual parent property in the design panel. And this will allow you to add customizable nested instances in your components. So you can set a default instance, and then you can actually go ahead and change it. So right now I've set the default instance to the plus button, and I can go in and, change that to something like, the date range, and then we can just customize, what color that is over here. If you have styles, oops, let's get that. And if we click into that instance, we can basically just, make it white if we want to. So that's how you're going to have different instances, text properties, and Boolean properties. And that's why it's so cool and powerful. I've been getting this question a lot. When should I use properties versus variants? So this is going to be the ultimate answer right here. You ready? Component properties and variants are going to work together. They're like a team. But sometimes a property is going to make way more sense. And in other instances, a variant is going to be the way better choice. And I'm going to show you why. So if you have a major visual change like we see here, like a disabled state or, just color change, we have size changes, that is when variants are going to really come into play. So any major visual change, like a variant in size, color, or other types of styling. So I have border, adding a border or a thicker border, something like that, or a background effect where there's a drop shadow that comes in. And the other aspect here is you need to communicate some sort of interactive state. So an example is a hover state. And with interactive components in Figma, you can link those together, and that's where, properties are not going to really help you as much. Now, you really should use component properties if your component has toggleable configurations, like a version with or without an icon like that button. Or say, let's see, I have another example here. So this card, you don't need to make many variations, if you want one without text or, with no button, all can be toggled off with properties. So your component should have, toggleable configurations like a version with and without an icon like I just mentioned, or your component has instances or text layers that need customization. So don't make different variants in those situations. And that is why they work together in harmony. So definitely use them together. And now you know exactly when to use properties and when to use variants. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are actually going to get into creating our own variations and component properties. So right now, what we have here is we have this card that I created. I'm actually going to show you how I created that card, but we're going to start with buttons, and we are going to make our own button component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from scratch so you can see, but I'm going to use some of these components here and you can too. Okay, so I'm going to call this my button label. So that's my text layer. I'm going to wrap that in an auto layout frame with a Shift A. And I call this button. Okay. And now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to call it test button so I don't get confused. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this button white. So I'm going to add that fill there. That's fine. And let's zoom in a bit. We're going to make sure this is centered. And we're going to set a fixed height. Let's do something like 48. It's going to be a big chunky button. And the width, that's fine. In terms of the padding inside the auto layout frame, we are going to do something like maybe 32 pixels. And we'll do like a 4 pixel border radius at the top. Okay, so now we have our button. Super nice button here. And, I think we'll just maybe bump up that size to like 16 pixels. Okay, so we have our button. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to throw in one of these components. So I'm going to throw the arrow forward component in there. And I'm going to make sure that's spaced nicely. And then I'm going to turn this into a component. So I'm just going to press this button. We're not going to make variants with this button just yet. We're just going to keep this as one button. We're not really worried about hover states. We can do hover states, and maybe it'll make sense to do a hover state for this, but we are just going to keep it like this, and we're going to work on creating properties for this card component. So let's jump in. All we have to do is go into this properties panel on the right sidebar. Once it's a component, click plus, and we are going to create a Boolean property. And I'm going to call this icon. And right now the value is going to be set to true. And that is because, it's showing right now. So I'm just going to keep that on. And I'm going to leave it for now. Because right now it's not connected to anything. To connect it, I can go into here, go to the layer section, because this is going to be for your Boolean properties, because it's showing and hiding. So it'll actually hide the whole thing. So it's going to be in the layer property, and you're just going to select the one you want to connect it to. So now that one is connected with this little indicator, and you can disconnect it there if you want. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my test button over here. I'm going to create another property. It's going to be an instance swap. And where am I going to do it? Okay, so that's my instance swap. I'm going to say icon type. Then I'm going to go to pick an instance. Over here, where is it? I'm going to call this arrow. There you go, arrow forward. Okay, so once again, it's not connected. So I'm going to go into that, that type of component over here. And this is the instance panel. So this is the normal instance panel where you can, swap everything. And now you can actually connect it. So apply the instance swap property. So this one's called icon type. And it's showing up there. And the last property we are going to apply for this button is the text property. And over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say label. And the value is going to be button label. So I'm going to create that property. And obviously that one is not connected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this. And as you can see on the bottom right here on the right sidebar, we have one area here called content. And we can connect that one. And there we go. Now when we take a copy of this component, we can turn it off the icon. We can also swap the icon. And we can also change the label. And that's how you create a button with component properties. Hey everyone, now that we have our button with component properties like we just created together, I'm just going to leave that instance there. Actually, I'm just going to delete it. We're going to create a variant of this button. We're just going to have a hover state, just 2 variants. And you may have more because you may want to have the ability to just have one button component and just swap between styles and sizes, and then, do those component property, make those decisions, when you're within your designs, which gives you a lot of flexibility. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually create a variant. So you can either do this. You can either click on that master component and add variant, or you can go into the properties panel and add a variant. So that's just going to give us a nice box, that bounding box that we often see with variants, but there's only one in here. So what I did was I just turned it into an auto layout frame that's going to hold all my variants. And then I'm going to make a copy of this. And all I'm going to do with this copy of the variant is I'm going to just make it just a hover. And that means I'm just going to come in here and, change that opacity. Actually, you know what? What I'm going to do is for this hover, I'm going to make the background color just a little bit, see-through. So we got 80%. I think that's going to be fine for now. I'm going to click on the box that's holding it all. And I'm going to call this state. So I'm definitely working on a state change that's very visual. So I have my default state, which is fine. So it's named over here, the current variant. And then I have my other state, which we're going to just call hover. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to just quickly illustrate some interactive components. You should have this checked. We'll get into this much later. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, link it up really nicely, really quickly. So while hovering, that's all I want to do. I'm going to make sure that's, just smart animate, and we can, do 200 milliseconds. So we're going to keep it really simple. And this one is on mouse leave, just in case. We don't always have to use on mouse leave. Okay, so we have our interactive component. We're just going to leave that as is. And now we have our test button. So whenever we use that in a design, and we're going to just grab a card here. So we can just grab this. Oops. We can grab one of these cards. It doesn't really matter which card, to be honest. You can grab the component card, or you can put that button in that component. But here we go. Okay, so I'm going to grab an instance here and just throw that in there. And I'm going to make that fill the container. I'm going to delete this component that we have in there already. So this is our test button. Now it's in this card. What I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to go into my prototype. And I'm going to just create the flow starting point right here. And then I'm going to press play. So let's see how our variant component reacts in here. Okay, there we go. So it's in there. Perfect. So we have our Boolean, our instant swap. Oh, okay. So the one thing we didn't do right was that we just grabbed it in there. Let me just make sure everything is still connected. There we go. Okay. I'm going to now just hold it so we get the instance. Okay, there we go. Perfect. So now we are going to fill. And we're just going to make that a starting point. We'll call it flow 1. It doesn't matter. And see, now you can get that hover state. And we can make it even better. Like we can say that, you know, maybe that background changes to like 50% opacity. So it's much more obvious. And there you go. We made a little quick interactive component. And every time we use this button, it's going to be interactive on every screen. So we don't need to make multiple screens anymore. But that is how you create a component with a variant. So if we take a look and just recap, we have this button that has all, so I'm selecting at the very high component level, which is like that parent level, and these are the variants within. I have all the properties below it, and I have the variant as well. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Let's get a little bit more practice in and talk about how we can remake this card right here. So what I've done here is I have the illustration, that's a Boolean property. I have the heading text property, the body Boolean property, body copy text property, and then we have the button property. So we are going to remake this. So let's grab our component or our card that we were using last time that's connected to our new test button. So we're just going to move everything over here. And so the way to just go about doing this, because I don't think we're going to need multiple cards, to be honest, because we can do a couple things here. We can, you know, maybe there is a multiple card. I wouldn't say for color, because then you can just change color to, you know, something like this or something like that if you really wanted to, you know, change that color. And if we want to go more on brand with our product, we'd probably have something along the lines of, you know, something like this, but I'm going to actually keep it purple. I like the purple. Everything seems to look really nice in this. So what we're going to do is we are going to just create this as a component. It's already set up for you. And now we can just play around with the properties. So I'm not going to make variants here. I'm going to work on Boolean. So I'm just going to call this illustration. And right now the illustration is true. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through every single property. And then I'm going to come back and actually, you know, fix it. So I have heading. Right now that's true. I'm going to say text, heading, content. Boom, that's done. And then we have the another property, which is going to be another Boolean, which is going to be for the body copy. Body. So we're just going to call that true right now. And then we're going to do the text for the body. So as you can tell, like we're moving really, really fast. And that's totally fine. I mean, I'm just going to call this one body content. Because once you get a hang of it all, like it's literally like lightning fast. And then we are going to Boolean toggle the button. Then I'm going to show you all the different variations that come out of this. So let's go into each piece and connect them all. So, oops, now we got our illustration here. All we're going to do is we are going to go to the layer area and connect the illustration. Over here, we are going to go to the heading and connect the heading. And we'll also at the very same time, we're going to connect the content here. So we have heading content. So that's connected. You notice how the text changed because that's the text I set for it before. So then we have our body and our body content. And then our button over here, which also has its own properties. So I'll show you how that works in a second. And then we are going to toggle that as well. So if we now go to the parent level, we have everything nicely laid out. And it looks like just like your standard component. So I can shrink it, I can grow it, I can make that instance. So I'm just going to hold down Option, or in your case, if you're on Windows, that's going to be Alt. So I have this variation now. And now I can, I'm going to use my Lorem Ipsum plugin. But I can generate some text there. And okay, so now I can go ahead and make copies of this instance, but I can also start saying, okay, I just want this one to be like a heading, no button. So we have a different card variation like that. And this one is just going to be a button and some heading copy. This one over here is going to be a button or no button and an illustration included. Maybe there's no body copy here, or maybe there's no heading. So there's a lot of ways you can, mess around with this. But if I go into, say, one of my variations here and, use this test button, now I can actually, I'm going to hide this icon. And you notice this nested style hides as well, because you can't really apply an instance when the actual parent instance isn't there. So it's been toggled off. And, I can go ahead and, write stuff. And there you go. And this will be hoverable because it's based off of this component. So if I start a new prototype, like flow 2, and then I go into my prototype over here, my presentation view. So it's always going to be interactive. So that's how you combine components. That's how you create variants within components. And that's how you work with component properties with multiple components as well. So now we have all the necessary skills we need to create some really interesting and reusable cards, buttons, and other elements. Hey everyone, welcome back. So I want to talk about how I came about creating some of these components, at least the more complex ones. Now we have our different input fields, we have input lists, dropdowns, we have text areas, different versions of those text areas. And let's start with just the input field. This is probably the more complex component, and we're going to just go right into it. So if I'm going to take a variant or an instance out of one of the variants here, over here you can notice there's a bunch of different options available. If we dig right into the component, we'll see that there's the label stack at the top. Inside the label stack, we have a couple different options here. Because if we go back to and think about all like the best practices stuff that we have here, all this stuff over here is built with all these components that we have available to us. So there's definitely a lot of variety with them, and there's so many things you can do. So I've built a lot of functionality into here. So you have the ability to toggle your optional label or whatever type of extra text you want to put there. We have other options like putting a icon. So that's just it for the label stack. If we go to the text input, which is the main container here, it's another auto layout frame. And in here, we have another icon on the left side. We have icons on the right side. And then we just have the text value within. And you can see that they're connected in two ways. We also have an error and a success message. Oops. Let's go back to that. So we have an error message and a success message. So that is how it's basically created. It's all stacked within an auto layout frame as well, and everything is pretty much toggleable. So you can select a state. Okay, here's my success state. And if I want to not have a label here, I can remove that label. And if I want to, change the value, I can change the value. If I want it to be empty, I can leave it empty. I can also have like a write icon and change the instance of that icon if I need to. And then I have my success message. So you could have a help icon as well, right here. So this one's a pretty complex input, but now they're set up for you to use whenever you like. You can take these components and duplicate them into your file. That's probably the best way to go about it, is just taking everything, copy and pasting it into like a little assets page if you need to use these types of components. But that is how the input was made. You'll notice there's some base components here. They're labeled with an underscore, the name, and then at the end they have the name base. And that means basically that where you're gonna edit these types of components. Okay, they also are interactive. So like when you click on this radio button, it's gonna turn active, and when you click on the active state, it's gonna turn inactive. Same thing with like the checkbox as well. Then I have a list item, which has the text. You'll see it over here in the layers panel, but it'll have this base component as well. So it's kind of like building upon piece by piece. And then you can go ahead and use them like this. So that way you don't need to change the style of each individual piece here or line item. You just have to change it once over here in the base. So if I say I want to go into my design tab, so if we keep a lookout and I want to change this to like bold, it's going to change for, my variance of the radio and my variance of the checkbox. Now, a lot of these are broken into different types of states. So these are the variants here. We have like default. This one is just like default empty. We have two different variants there. And then we have the input list where we have, the Boolean on the label. So if the Boolean property, you don't need to say, oops, let me grab an instance here. You can just toggle the label off if you need to, and you can specify if you want it to be radio or checkboxes, because they basically follow the same design pattern. And then on the right, we have dropdowns, and it's essentially just an input. And dropdowns don't have many states. They just have like that open state. So they do have like the label, and you could put like the optional label here. You can even put like the help icon if you want. And then you can choose between open and closed with the option list. And then the text area is very simple as well. We basically have a couple of variants in the sense that we have like, the value within. We can toggle the label icons, the optional label. You can customize the value within, like what the text says, and we can also, have a disabled version, active version with the outline, and then we have a pill version, like one of those advanced inputs. So all of these are using a lot of auto layout to toggle those features and ensure that whenever they are toggled off, whether it's like an icon in this instance, things are very responsive. And even if they're stacked on one another in another auto layout frame, they kind of will close and open like this. So I'm going to take both, Shift A, and if I say I'm going to toggle off this success message, everything is responsive within. So that is how I went about creating some of the components here for forms. Hey everyone, and welcome back. So we are going to be working on our very own registration / onboarding flow. This is where users have committed to signing up and creating an account, and then they are going to select some things that are going to help us give them more relevant results within our product. So things like customizing their profile with, why are they joining maybe, or what interests they have. So let's jump right in. So I have my registration flow. If you have wireframes around this, bring them in as well. My user flow is almost acting like a pretty nice set of incredibly low fidelity wireframes. Like, it doesn't really tell me much about the content just yet, but I'm just going to work based off of what I already know. Since I've been working on this for quite some time, I think I already know what I want. So definitely bring in all your existing work. I'm going to start with a iPhone 13 Pro screen just over here. I'm going to work beneath it. So you'll probably already have some designs here. You can choose to work on something different, or you can watch my workflow. You can also work with me side by side and see how some of these components that we have built together can actually, feed into this section here. Okay, so as I'm looking at this, one of the first very important user flows, let's look at step 1. User arrives at our welcome screen and notices a button to proceed forward to registration. The user can skip this step. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my assets panel and just grab my button. So I already have a button here, and that's all I'm going to need right now. So I can close that panel, but I'm going to throw this button here. Just bring it out. Now at this point, I'm still not super high fidelity. I'm really just figuring out, okay, let's get some text, actual text over here on the screen instead of these boxes. Let's start thinking about what copy is going to go here. Sometimes we'll be working with content writers or UX writers, but it's always great to fill in the copy as much as possible with copy that is actually meaningful. So don't always use lorem ipsum unless you're really trying to move quickly. Okay, so welcome to the largest, or maybe the world's largest used store. I think that's a little cute way of saying it. And at this point as well, as I'm starting to build fidelity little by little, I'm going to be using some of the fonts that I've already started to say, or at least finalize in some way. So I have 32 pixel Laura. I'm just going to make this 115 or 125%. And then it's going to be semi-bold. So there is my title. And then at the bottom, I'm going to make a skip, or maybe it's not a skip at this point because it's your user flows can be wrong. You don't need to follow them to a T. Already have an account, login. So I'm just going to change this to Inter, which is the font that I chose as my more basic UI font. I'm going to just bring this up, and we are going to make this regular. I'm not worried too much about color as well just yet. And here, probably just underline it and maybe make it medium. Okay, so this is our first screen. Now it's starting to come in. I think the next step after this step that we're working through right now is to, go ahead and make incorporate some imagery in here, and also some other things like fine-tuning the text. So I'm going to make a copy. Oops, I'm just going to Command C and V. So the next step in the process is the user is prompted to add their email and password. They can confirm those details and proceed. Okay, that's pretty easy. Let's go ahead and do that. So maybe we'll have a screen here or some text here that says create account. And I made it 32 pixels because, I'm just creating hierarchy from screen to screen. This is like the big welcome screen. This is the secondary screen. So, little less punchy with the text. And okay. And then I'm going to use this again. I'm going to bring that up, holding Option or Alt. Find the things that you love. So just some secondary text. I'm not going to make that underline, but I am going to decrease the opacity just to signify, okay, this is 75%. So I'm not using all my colors just yet. I'm just, trying to lay a lot of the content out. And I'm going to start using some of my components here. So I have one component here, or you know what? I'm going to use one of my button components. So I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to make this as a secondary button component. And then I'm just going to say, I'm going to make it really easy for them. Sign up with Google. So going straight to a social sign in right away. And then we're going to give them the option, another thing I do want to stress here is I'm not trying to be super perfect, but I am I'm starting to build that fidelity. So I'm not really too worried about how things are laid out just yet in terms of the renaming of layers and whatnot. So I'm going to just Shift A. There we go. I take my other rules that I have in here, making a nice little area. I'm going to shrink it in. Okay. Okay, or sign up with email. Maybe this is at 50% and 12 pixels. Okay. And then below that, now we can use some of our actual components. And so the first one I have here is we have full name, maybe. Actually, I don't even think we need full name. Let's do email. So we have email, and then I don't even think we need a placeholder for this. So we can just toggle that off. Then we have password. And we could do something where it's let's have the right icon and it's visibility. Let's see, where is that? So we could play with that icon there. We can leave it on the, okay. Oops. Let's go into my layer. Where's the value? And just to keep that over on the right side. So, okay. So now we have this screen here. I'm not going to really use auto layout just yet because, it takes a lot of time to go through that process over and over again. Now, I think, the one thing here that we need is just to let them know what step they're in. Step 1. And then I'm going to wrap this in an auto layout frame. I'm going to make sure that there's little to no spacing between. Then I'm going to duplicate within it. So I'm going to select that layer within it, as you can see in my layers panel. So I have that layer within this frame, and I'm just going to duplicate it, Command D or Control D. And then I'm going to write of 4. So we're going to make 4 steps here. And just to create a bit more hierarchy. That can go up there. And then we'll probably just give them like an easy way to exit. Okay. And boom, we have one of our very first screens here. Keeping it super simple. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and I'm going to continue in the next video. Okay, so I left off over here. I think what I'm going to do here is, change that button text to let's begin. Over here, we're going to change this button text to sign up. And then, you could go ahead and, leave this here just in case they have something that they need to if they do have like a login, just to leave it there just in case, which is sometimes the case. So, you can start thinking about some micro copy like this. By continuing, you accept our standard terms and conditions and our privacy policy. So I think one thing people often forget is that, there's a lot of copy like this that goes, uncared for, just because it's just the nature of the copy. Like a lot of people find this kind of stuff really boring, which they're not necessarily wrong, but it's still like one of those things that we need to think about as well, because it will affect like smaller things like just layout. So we have that, maybe bump that up a little bit. Okay, that's good. We're just going to stop there. Next step in our process is the user can add a photo or skip that step and move forward. Okay, so I'm just going to actually copy this screen. Oops, copy and paste. I just have a habit of doing that. And okay, so now we are on step, I would say this is step 2 of 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the 2, giving them a good understanding of, I don't even think we need that over here. So we can take that out. Just giving them a good understanding of like how far along we're in. Maybe we'll add a progress bar as we like build up the fidelity here, keeping everything up here very similar, not having jumping things around the screen. And then some text here that says like add a photo so other members know who you are. I think there's a couple things we can do here. Maybe we bump up to like 16 pixels, and we can probably go down to like just something a little bit softer. And that's fine. Just trying to create a little bit more space. And I'm going to actually remove all this because we're not going to need it. Maybe it makes sense to bring in like a icon here. We'll have like a little skip button at the bottom, because maybe this is not like a super important thing. I wouldn't say it is. And here we go. Upload my photo. So once again, thinking about how to make those buttons a bit more personable. So what icons do we have here? Do we have any icons that can really help? Probably not. What we can do is go into our plugins. If you have this plugin material design icons, really helpful. And I'm just going to search up for profile or user. Let's see what we have here. This one can work for us. Oops. we can customize this if we need to. We just leave it like that. Just delete that. Okay, because we're moving fast, right? So I'm just gonna have a circle. And we'll just leave it like that. So there we go. We have an add a photo. Let's move on to the next screen. So we can just remove our little hack together solution. Move these buttons down. Now you can use like a lot of auto layout to really help you move through this quicker, or not quicker, but I mean in a more controlled way. So step 3, what is your main reason of joining? I think the user can add a photo. Okay, so I think this is the problem here. We maybe missed a section, and that's going to be normal. So I think we should probably have a section that says something along the lines of like, what's your main reason for joining? And I'm going to just make sure that's at the top. And say something like this will help us make great recommendations. And have this there. Okay, so here I'm gonna once again, we can either use our buttons or we don't really have to. We could use our list item here as well. We can create other versions. I don't know, we'll see how this kind of plays out, but I'm going to remove the label on our checkboxes. Discover new products. This one is make monthly shopping easier, maybe. Relevant recommendations. So depending on what they may select here, we can, change our designs accordingly. So, their experience could be much different. So if they want to discover new products, maybe we're serving up like different products all the time to them. If they want to make monthly shopping easier, maybe we have like a subscribe like section where they can subscribe for like monthly products that are, just for them. Maybe if they want relevant recommendations, it's like we're always serving up like consistent updates to like what they've bought. So if they bought something like a controller for like a system, then maybe we're serving up video game suggestions. Or maybe if they have like a fashion interest, then we're serving up relevant products within that category. So that's that. And then the next one we have is, okay, step 4 here. It says the user can now pick interests and hobbies to personalize their shopping experience. So I'm just going to quickly start this one because we're at the very end here, and get started by picking some interests. I'm going to delete that because I don't think we need it. I'm going to delete that. So we can have a bit more fun when it comes to like brand, especially in like these onboarding screens. So we have upload photo here. I think like the next thing we're going to do is continue just for the button labels because these are like mandatory. Continue. Okay, and I think that's going to be it for this video. Hey everyone, and welcome back. So I am going to start adding some really nice like toggle boxes. So as you can see, I have like this over here. And we can do a couple things here. I'm just going to detach this component completely. So I'm going to go in here and detach the instance. I'm just going to call it card. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove that. And then I think I'm even going to, we can mess with this button a bit. So let's call it add, and remove the fill. We can put a stroke on it, so you can go ahead and even mess with your own buttons like that. Just make it like that, and there we go. So feel free to go ahead and mess with your buttons even when you're like prototyping like this. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to just like have a couple of different options. They're not a couple, but like several options here that they can interact with. So I have that. I'm going to just make this a bit smaller. And the text in here can probably be something around like 20. The actual padding, I'll probably keep it really small to like 16. And then instead of having padding between items, we're just going to make it so that it's space between them. We're going to set like a set height like that. Okay, so we have gaming. Maybe there's like reading. I'm going to make a whole grid here. Fashion. And the last one I'm going to have is something like music. So I'm going to actually, going based off of like some of the color work that I've been thinking about, I'm going to start like just adding the different instances. Like maybe there's a purple over here, and maybe this one's like more on brand with like a yellow. Maybe it's a little bit more paler than that. And then the green is maybe like a version of the blue, like, oh, that's a little too blue, but maybe it's like that. So now we have like some pretty nice color tiles, and they all kind of fit really nicely together. They complement each other well, and just gives somebody who's coming through this flow, just a nice way to interact with them. Now let's think about what it looks like when they're clicked. So, I have messed around with this instance a bunch, but I'm going to actually I'm going to add an icon here with like a check. Okay. So like, I'm not a big fan of that check mark, and I don't have another icon right now for it, but what I can do is I can just go back into my material icons here. I can go and find the check icon that I'm looking for, something like that. Drag it. What size is this? I think that's 20 by 20 in the top it said. Oops. Let's just make it 20 by 20. And then I can detach these instances all together. So I'm using Option Command B. And if you look in terms of like the actual component here, right click, that's going to be your shortcut. Once you get used to like inputting all the shortcuts, you're just flying at this point. So that looks nicer than the actual square. So I'm going to remove that. The circled version. And there we go. And I think at the end, just to cap this off, we're going to copy it and it's going to show up over here. Let's see. Success. The user has registered for the new product and can now access all of our features. Okay, perfect. So I think at this point, like, this is a part where we can like maybe put some confetti pop or something. I'm not too, worried about that just yet. I just want to make sure that the flow seems good, and then I'm going to start building up the fidelity from here. And I'm just thinking about text again. Registration complete. Get ready to have the best shopping experience of your life. Okay, perfect. And I think, just to maybe cap this off, we have like a button that says like, let the shopping begin. Something like that. And maybe it's on brand. Like at this point, it's like, okay, now I'm starting to think about what colors make sense here. Should I be using like a nice yellow, like the logo that we have? Should I be using like a different color? So definitely start thinking about incorporating brand as you build up the fidelity, and you start thinking about things like a border radius and what is the proper form process we're going to use. So do we like the stepping process here, or is it a combination maybe with like a progress line across, which I like using a lot. It's very visual. And just thinking about like the the copy within each form item or button, and keeping your form items very, very simple can really add to a nice, delightful experience. And this is something that somebody can literally complete in probably under 5 minutes, maybe even less. So that is how you create a flow or a registration flow in Figma.